Welcome to lab exercise number 7. In this lab, we're going to learn how to use the advanced transfer template, and we're going to use the leave, enter, and transporters module mainly. So at this point, you should have read the problem description, but let's go over the most important aspects of this problem. So every 10 minutes, we have a part that is arriving to our system, and there are in total 3 workstations, workstation A, B, and C. So in each station there is a single machine, and there are 3 types of parts, and they have equal probability of arriving. So it's 1/3 the probability. Okay, so once parts are in our system, then we know that there are some priorities. So part 3 has priority at workstation C, and part 2 has priority at for the processing in workstation B. So for the priorities, remember that we use the queues mainly. Then we know the information of the processing times. So we know that part 1 goes to workstation A and then to workstation C. In each workstation there is a processing time. So we know the information of which workstation visits every part, and we know the processing time in each station. Additionally, we know the information of the forklifts. So we know that we require forklifts in order to transport parts from one station to the other. So we know the speed of each forklift, which is 500 feet per minute, and there is a loading and unloading time per part that is equal to 30 seconds. The rule that we're going to use for the trucks, for the forklifts, is that the closest forklift is assigned to a part requesting the transport. And then we have a matrix with the distances between stations. So this is a metric table. So these distances are the same. For example, if we're going to go from arrive to the workstation A, it takes 100 feet, but in the opposite direction, we have the same distance. It's 100 as well. So in total, we have 20 distances. So for this particular problem, we want to report the following statistics: the average cycle time for part 1, 2, and 3, the average total waiting time for part 3, and the total transport time, including loading and unloading for part 1, 2, and 3. So this is the first part of the problem. We want to include the animation, but the animation will be discussed in a second video. This initial video will focus just on the model logic, and in the second video we're going to discuss the details of the animation. There is one more part when there is a modification of the original problem that we're going to discuss it later once we have finished the first problem. Okay, so let's start our simulation. So let's go to Arena. So initially we know that every 10 minutes there is a part arriving. So this is the part's arrival. We know that it's a constant, the interval time is a constant of 10 minutes. So once one part arrives, so now we need to assign different attributes. So we want to assign the entity type, we want to assign the sequence. So the first step is to create an index. So we need an attribute. Let's call it part index. This is basically the part number or part type. So let's build an expression, and we're going to use a random distribution, a discrete random distribution. We know that the the three parts are arriving with the same probability, so that's 1/3. So 1/3 of the parts are going to be part 1. This is a cumulative distribution, so 2/3 are part 2, and 1, which is probability 1, will be 3. That's part 3. Okay, so we have created 3 part index. So once we have created the part index, now we will be able to assign the entity type. So the entity type, let's assign it as an attribute, entity type. So we're going to create a set. Let's call it entity type. And we need an index for that set. So the index that we're going to use is the one that we have created, which is the part index. Let's call it part type. I'm not gonna use entity type because maybe that a name is assigned by Arena to a different function. So I'm just gonna call it part type. So part type, parenthesis, part index. So this is gonna be a vector that contains the different numbers. So we need to create this vector. So let's click on OK, and let's go to assets. So that set is going to contain the entity type. So we need to assign the same name, so it's part type. So the type is entity type. And now we have to create the members. So in this problem we have 3 different entity types. So that's going to be part 1, part 2, and part 3. So we have created a set named part type, and that set contains 3 members. And in this assign, we're assigning that value. So the entity type is going to be equal to the part type set, parenthesis, part index. And now we need to add the sequences. So right now I'm just going to create the different sequences, but as we continue, as we make progress in this problem, once we have finished our stations, then we will be able to fill the information of each sequence. So right now I'm just going to create the set for the sequences. So let's create an attribute, and that's the entity sequence. So we're going to call that set part sequence. And we need an index, the index that we have created, which is the part index. And now we know that we need to create a set called part sequence, and that set should contain 3 sequences. One sequence for part 1, the second sequence for part 2, and third sequence that it's for part 3. Okay, so let's create the part sequence set. So we go to advanced set, and let's create part sequence. So the set type is going to be other, and we're going to create 3 members. So let's define those members first. So in sequence, we will need 3 sequence. So that's going to be sequence part 1, then sequence part 2, and sequence part 3. So now for each sequence we need to define the steps. We're going to do that later because I haven't created the stations in our set. So once we create the stations and we assign a name to those stations, we will be able to define each step. But so far we have created the set, the advanced set, and that advanced set contains or should contain 3 members, which are part sequence 1, sequence part 2, and sequence part 3. Okay. So now we have assigned the part index, the entity type, and the sequence. So let's call this assign entity type and sequence. Okay, so once we have provided the complete information to each part, so now we're able to continue in our modeling. So let's start by creating the first station. It's like the arrival of the parts. So let's call it station arrival. And the station name is arrival st. So once a part arrives to our system, so we need to request a forklift. So that's why we need a leave. So leave arrival. There is a delay. Remember that we need 30 seconds per part in order to load or unload each part. So there is a 30 seconds delay. The allocation, this part is important especially for our statistics. Please notice that in the table that we want to provide at the end, the total transport time, including loading and unloading. So we want in the transportation time, we want to include the loading and unloading. That means that if we leave the allocation as value added, this time will be mixed with the time that is added in a process time, in a process block. So we don't want to mix those times because we want to include it in the transportation time. So Arena is going to refer to that time as the transfer time. So let's call it, that's why we're going to change the allocation from value added to transfer, because we want to include these 30 seconds in the transportation time. So for the transfer out, we're going to request a transporter. So now we need the transporter name. It's a forklift. The selection rule, by default, it's cyclical, but we want the smallest distance. And then we need to save an attribute. This attribute, it's important because we have 2 transporters. So we want to make sure that once the part arrives to the next station, we're going to release the correct transporter. So in order to free the correct transporter, we need to save the attribute. And this attribute, basically, it's like the index of the transporter that it's transporting the part. The connect type, it's going to be transport, and it's going to be transported by sequence. Because remember that we have defined a sequence to each part. Okay, So here we leave the arrival. So now let's create workstations A, B, and C. So for each station we need an enter. So remember that an enter is like an station, but in the enter we will be able to release or free the transporter. So let's change the name first. So this is enter workstation A. There is a delay. Remember that we have 30 seconds in order to load and unload. So here we're going to unload the part. The allocation is transfer in seconds, 30 seconds. So transfer in, so we're gonna free the transporter. Transporter name is forklift. And the unit number, remember that we have created an attribute which is the forklift num, which was assigned previously. So in this attribute is where we keep the transporter index. Okay, so once a part arrives to the workstation, then there is a process. So this is a sys delay release. So we need a resource at workstation A, let's call it resource A, quantity 1. And for the processing time, let's use an expression in minutes. So we're going to use an attribute. So we need to create this attribute process time. This process time will be assigned in the sequences. When we're creating the sequence for each part, we will be able to assign an attribute. So in that part is where we're going to add this process time attribute. So this is process workstation A. And once we're done with the process, then we need to keep transporting our entity or our parts to the next station. So in order to do that, we need a leave. So this leave will leave the workstation A. And remember that we need 30 seconds in order to unload that part to the forklift. And the allocation, it's in transfer. Transfer out will be request transporter. The name of the transporter is forklift. Same rule, smallest distance. And the save attribute will be forklift num. Connect type is transport by sequence. Okay, so now we need to duplicate this logic for workstation B and C. You gotta be careful with the names. So the enter for workstation B. Same delay, 30 seconds, free transporter. That's fine. So now the process, it's process workstation B. We need to change the name of the attribute because it's not the same. We have a single attribute per workstation. So it's resource B. And the processing time is going to be process time, is the same name for the attribute. And finally, in the leave, this leave workstation B. Transfer to 30 seconds. We're going to request a transporter. So the rest of the information is correct. So we need to create one more workstation, which is going to be the workstation C. So let's rename each block. So this is workstation C. 30 seconds. Process workstation C. and leave workstation C. Okay, so once we're done with the 3 stations, remember that there is an exit station. So that's the last station. So exit. This is where our parts leave the system, and there is a 30 seconds for the unload, and the location is transfer. And remember that we need to release, we need to free the transporter. And the unit number is forklift num. And once we are done, so we just dispose parts. Okay, so we're still missing a lot of points. First, we need to provide the information of the sequences. Then we need to add the matrix with the distances. And remember that there are some priorities. So let's start with the sequences. So let's go to the advanced transfer, sequence. So the sequence for part 1. So we know that part 1 goes to workstation A and then workstation C. Part 2 goes to workstation A and then B. And part 3 goes to workstation B and then workstation C. So let's start with part 1. So the first station is workstation A. Let's increase the size of the column. So this is enter workstation A. And then remember that we need to assign the processing time. So we call that attribute the process time. So it's process time. And for the value, we need to create an expression. And that expression, it's a triangular distribution. Parameters for part 1 at workstation A are 8, 12, and 16. So then there is a second station, which is workstation C. And again, we need to create the attribute for the process time. So it's a triangular distribution. Parameters are 9, 15, 21. And there is one more station, which is the exit. So after workstation C, the part leaves the system. So enter exit station, but now we don't need to assign a process time, this attribute. So now let's define the sequence for part 2s. So we know that part 2 goes first to the workstation A. So let's assign an attribute, process time, and it's a triangular distribution with parameters 10, 14, and 18. Then the second step is the workstation B. And let's create the same attributes. Process time, triangular distribution, and parameters are 7, 11, and 15. And the last station is the exit. That's for part 2. And now for part 3, we know that part 3 first visits workstation B. We need the process time. It's a triangular distribution. Parameters 9, 12, and 15. So after workstation B, the next stop is at workstation C. Where the process time, it's a triangular distribution with parameters 8, 11, and 14. And after visit B, C, then the next station is the exit station. Okay, so far we have created the 3 sequences, and we know that these 3 sequences are contained within an advanced set that we defined previously, which is the part sequence. Here we have sequence part 1, sequence part 2, and sequence part 3. So those sequences were assigned in this assign at the beginning, right here, part sequence. Okay, so far we have created our stations, the sequences. Now let's provide the information for the transporter. So we know that we have a forklift, but the number of units, it's 2. There are 2 forklifts in our system. So the speed by default, it's 50 feet per minute, 50, and units minute. Okay, so now let's add the information of the distances. So we need 20 distances in total. So let's start with the arrival station. So from the arrival station to workstation A, let's increase the column length. Okay, so the distance, it's 100. So now from arrival station to workstation B, the distance is 100. So from the arrival station to the workstation C. The distance is 200, and from the arrival station to the exit station, the distance is 300. So now let's continue with workstation A. So from workstation A to the arrival station, remember that this is a symmetric matrix, so it's 100. The workstation A, from workstation A to workstation B, the distance is 150. From workstation A to workstation C, the distance is 100. So you know that this process takes time. You gotta be careful in this part because it's easy to input the incorrect number. So take your time when you are adding these distances. So from workstation A to the exit takes 200 feet. And now for workstation B to the arrival, that's 100. So from workstation B to workstation A, that's 150. From workstation B to workstation C, that's 100. And from workstation B, here it's from B to C actually. Be careful. And from workstation B to the exit, that's 200. Okay, so now let's define workstation C. So from workstation C to the arrival, that's 200. So from workstation C to workstation A, that's 100. From workstation C to workstation B, that's 100. From workstation C to the exit, that's 100. And now let's add the information for the exit. So from the exit to the arrival, that's 300. from the exit to workstation A, that's 200. From workstation, from exit to workstation B, that's 200. And from exit to workstation C, that's 100. So we have completed our 20 distances, but let's check. I just want to double check if numbers are correct. So take your time. I'm gonna take 1 minute to make sure that these numbers are correct. Okay, so let's continue. So we're done with the distances, the information of the transporter. And now remember that we need to add the priorities. So let's remember what are the priorities that we want to assign. So we know that part 3 has priority for processing in workstation C. So in workstation C part 3, we need to provide a higher priority. So please notice that there are just 2 parts visiting workstation C. Those parts are part 1 and part 3. So if we want to give a higher priority to part 3, so we know if we use the part index as an attribute, so if we give the priority based on the highest part index value, then part 3 is going to get like the higher priority. So let's go to our model. So we know that in part C. So let's go to queues. So that's process workstation C. The type by default is first in, first out. So now we're going to use the highest attribute value. And we're going to use the part index. So remember that the part index for part 3 it's 3, and for part 1 it's equal to 1. So if we give priority to the highest attribute value, then part 3 is going to get higher priority. Okay, so we have assigned priority to workstation C, but now let's check the priority for workstation B. So we know that part 2 has priority for processing in workstation B. But there are 2 parts visiting workstation B. We know that part 2 and part 3. And we want to give higher priority to a part 2. So we cannot use the highest attribute value, because if we use the highest attribute value, then we're going to give higher priority to part 3. But we want to assign higher priority to part 2. So instead of using the highest attribute value, now we're going to use the lowest attribute value, because we know that part 2 and part 3 are the only parts that are visiting workstation B. So for process at workstation B, we're going to assign the lowest attribute value based on part index. So in this case, we're giving higher priority to part 2. So in this particular program, it was easy to assign the priority using this part index, but in the case where it's not possible to reuse this attribute, so in that case we will need to create a new attribute. You can call it priority, and then we need to assign the correct values to those attributes in order to provide the priorities that we want to assign. So as I said, for this particular problem, this part index attribute will work in both cases, but in general that's not the case. So for further problems, maybe you will need to create a new attribute. Okay, but this will work. Okay, so let's double check the model before we run it. We're missing the setup. So replication parameters, the replication length is going to be 10,000 minutes. Single replication, base time units, minutes. So given that we're using transporters, maybe in the project parameter you want to activate transporters, especially if you want to analyze transporter utilization. Okay, so let's double check real quick the model before we run it. So parts are arriving every 10 minutes, that's a constant time. Then we assign a part index, the entity type based on that part index, and the entity sequence based on a set that we call part sequence and uses the part index as an index. So in order to use those sets, we created a set, part type, that provides the entity types. So there are part 1, part 2, and part 3. And the second set was created in advanced process, in advanced set, part sequence, where we have 3 sequences, the sequence for part 1, sequence for part 2, and sequence for part 3. And those sequences were created in the advanced transfer module. We have sequence part 1. So part 1 visits workstation A and then workstation C. We have the processing times, which are 8, the parameters are 8, 12, 16, and 9, 15, 21. So that's for part 1. So for part 2 visits workstation A and workstation B. The parameters for the process times are 10, 14, 18, and 7, 11, 15. And the last part, sequence part 3, it visits 3 stations, so B and C. So for B, the processing time is 9, 12, 15. And for C, it's 8, 11, 14. And then the exit. Okay, so we have checked all the information provided in the sequence, in each sequence. Now let's check the stations. So we have the 30 seconds, and we're using the selection rule smallest distance transporter, and we're saving the attribute 30 seconds, and we're releasing or we're freeing the transporter, the forklift, using the same attribute. We have the resources using the attribute that we have created in the sequence. We have resource A, B, and C, and we have the leaf in order to request a forklift, and it's by sequence. Okay, so let's save our model and let's run it. Now let's run our model and let's check if it's working, or maybe there is a problem with some module. So it looks like there is something wrong with the number out. So let's check real quick if there is something delaying our model. This is the problem. So this is the importance of the units. Please notice that in the exit, the units are in minutes. So let's change it to seconds. So given that initial problem, the unloading time it's like very high. That's why the number out was low. So let's rerun our model. So our model is running. Let's check our numbers. Okay. So let's go back to our Word file where we have, so we know that we want to report the average cycle times for part 1, part 2, and part 3. That's the total time. So the average total time, it's 85.09 for part 1, that's in minutes. For part 2, the total time is 63.3. And for part 3, the total time is 60.39 minutes. So then we want to check the waiting time for part 3. So the wait time for part 3, it's 28.45. It's here. And then we want to report the transport time, including loading and unloading for part 1, 2, and 3. So those times are under the label of transfer time. So we have 9 minutes, 12 minutes, and 9 minutes. Those numbers are constants, so you can check those numbers real quick using the matrix and the speed of the forklift. And remember to add the load and unload time in each station, and you will get these numbers. Okay, so that's the first part of this problem. Now let's discuss about the second part. So for the second part, upon further study of the real system, you notice that the forklifts move 5, 10, and 15% slower when they are carrying part types 1, 2, and 3, respectively. Update your model and report the impact of this observation on the average cycle time of the part types. So basically now we want to change the speed of the forklifts. Remember that in our initial part, the speed was a constant, was 50 feet per minute. But now, when the forklift is low, the speed is lower, and that speed changes depending of which part it's that for lift transporting. So we need to add this logic to our model. So let's go back to our arena model. And we know that we want to change the leaf, basically. Because please notice that the leaf module does not allow to modify the speed of the transporter. And that's what we want to make now. We want to modify the speed of the transporter. So in order to do that, we're going to replace the leaf. And now we go to the advanced transfer. And we will need two different blocks. We need the request, because we want to request the transporter, and then we want to transport. So for the request, we need the transporter name. So in this case, we need to request our forklift. The selection rule, remember that is smallest distance, and the attribute is the forklift num. So the velocity here is 50. Why? Because remember that when we're requesting the forklift it's when it's arriving to the station, it's empty. So there is no part load on that forklift. That's why the speed, it's the normal speed. The different speed will be when the part is already loaded on the forklift. Okay, so this is the request one. Please notice that there is no way to add the 30 seconds in order to load the part, so that's why we will need to add a delay after the request. So let's add the delay of 30 seconds. So remember to modify the location to transfer. Delay time is 30 seconds, units seconds. And after the delay, now we will be able to transport using the forklift. Remember the forklift num. And the entity destination is by sequence. So here we will need to modify the speed, the velocity. So remember that the nominal value is 50, but it's going to decrease depending of which part is going to carry that forklift. So let's create a new variable or a new expression. Let's call it part speed. So for part 1, remember that it's going to decrease by 5%. So the part speed factor is going to be 0.95. That 0.95 is going to multiply this 50, and that's going to reduce the speed by 5%. So the index that we need here is part index. Remember that that attribute carries the information of the entity type, basically. So now we need to create this variable or expression. So you want to create it as a variable, that's fine, or as an expression, even though it's not changing, but it will work as well. Okay, so let's create that expression. So the name is part speed. It will have 3 rows, and values are 0.95, 0.90 and 0.85. Let's double check. It's 5%, 10%, and 15% slower. So that's why we're multiplying the original speed by this factor in order to reduce the speed by 5%, 10%, and 15% respectively. Okay. So now we need to duplicate these blocks because we are going to change these leaves for workstation A, workstation B, and workstation C. Verify that the information is correct. So now for workstation B, and finally for workstation C. So let's run our model and let's check if it's working correctly. Let's check the results. So here we want to compare the cycle time, so the total time. So let's bring back our Word file and let's report the average cycle time per part. So for the first part, it's 92.36. For part 2, it's 64.62. And for part 3 is 60.17. So if we compare these values, please notice that now for part 1, it's the total time it's 92 minutes and it used to be 85, so it increased. For part 2, the total time now it's 64.62 and the previous value was 63.3, so it increased. For part 3, it's kind of the same, it decreased a little bit, but in general the trend is that the values are increasing, which makes sense because remember that we modified the values for the speed, and now we are taking account of the reduction in the speed given that when the forklifts are loaded. So that's why these numbers are higher. Okay, so this is everything for this initial part in this problem. So I invite you to watch the next video where we're going to discuss the animation.